Nice to see you all here. Happy Halloween! I was going to wear a great costume, but I figured just myself was a great costume, so you know. Anyway, you can see kind of on the board over here, I've got kind of what we're going to do today. First thing I'd like to do is, are there any questions from any of the students other than the teaching project, which I'll get to in a second? Any questions so far? I'm really sad, but this is my last lecture. So, you'll have Rainey back, but it's been a real pleasure. I will be grading some stuff and different things for you, but I probably won't get to actually see your smiley little faces. So, if you have questions on any of my content for the next exam, please feel free to email me. I have a lot of content on the next exam, just because I've been here with you guys since exam 2, okay? We will have, oh, I forgot to write that up there. Well, we'll have a key room at the end of class. So we'll do just like we did here in the Twin Cities. We'll post the key up on the windows. You can take your form and you can go look. Make sure you're looking at rationales, not just what you got wrong or right, but why did you pick the one you did versus the one that you should have, okay? In Rochester, Lily does have your exam stuff there as well. She'll post it wherever she did the last time, and you guys will be able to review those as well. Again, the content is just getting more difficult, okay? It's not getting easier, and you're being asked to now kind of try to think about things in terms of putting things together. So we're not really having you think about things in silos, but we're going to be talking about fluid and electrolytes today. That has a lot to do with glucose management, as you'll find out. So nutrition had a lot to do with tissue and mobility, right? So everything kind of goes together. Juliana, you can throw that stuff on the floor if you want. I didn't mean to take up your whole table.
Do you want me to pass these out?
In a second. I don't want to have it too early. In any case, make sure that you're looking at the rationales. We really want for you to succeed in the course. Remember, you have to have 70% overall in exam grades for you to pass the test. To pass the course, okay? So if you're struggling, reach out. Make sure you're going to PALS. Make sure that you're doing things that are helping you be successful. Just reading the book cover to cover for each chapter is not likely to be the most successful thing that you can do, okay? You're going to get the content, but you're not going to get the concepts unless you start to really think about how to put them together, okay? Look at your NCLEX questions at the end of the chapters. And like I said, I think PALS probably is your best bet. If you haven't been going, please make sure that you think about that, especially if you're struggling, okay? If you're not able to go due to a job or something else in Rochester or here in the cities, reach out to your PALS coordinator. There's possibly a way that they can share some of the content that they're using, okay? The teaching project. I'm not sure what's going on with that. I did put out a call to Rainey. I know there are some directions on Canvas. I would use those for now. If there are specific or individual questions about it, shoot them to Rainey. I have my phone here on. I've asked him to call me or text me if there's anything specific he wants for me to share with you. In Rochester, I'll get kind of an idea. Are some of you struggling with the directions or what to do? Show of hands. Okay. Okay, good.
I did it last year.
Well, we changed it. That's the problem. And how about here in the cities? Questions, thoughts, problems? Okay. So I can relay that information to him, and since he's not been actually here doing content, we did it last time, but actually he's been working on making some changes, and so I'm not really I don't feel comfortable just sharing a bunch of stuff and then having all you guys hand in papers that are not what he wanted, and it really confuses the rubric and those kinds of things, okay? I think there's part of it due coming up this weekend, is that true?
I would say start it as soon as possible.
Yeah. So, I mean, if there's that many questions, I'm sure we can move the due date, that's not a big issue, so everybody's tension, stress level, bring it on down for the teaching project, okay? Sound good? So don't stress about that. I really want you to pay attention. This is a really hard concept. How many of you have had fluid and electrolytes now in pathophysiology? Oh, Lord. Yes, in phys? No. Rochester, you guys should have already had some of it, true? Well, if you haven't had it here in the cities, it's coming up. So the physiology teacher and myself, it's always kind of funny because whoever does this first is like laying the groundwork for the next one, and it's always like either he's really like, yay, they already know some of this, or I'm like, yay, they already know some of this. And so just know that that will be coming up in anatomy and physiology, and honestly, very quickly. We're usually about the same time, so it'll make sense by the time the exam comes, okay? All right, any other questions, thoughts, concerns? Okay, the next thing we're going to do is the Kahoot, so while I bring that up, I'm going to be passing out the papers here in the cities for you. Let me get your number up. All right, ready to join? There you go. And now, Juliana, if you want to pass those out, that's great.
Yeah.
One group had only 5 and the rest have 6.
Oh, it's about 5 groups.
Okay, yeah, probably. Probably. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, I think so.
Okay. You guys only. Oh, you guys. The 5 groups. We have a person. We have a guy missing today.
I think this is a 6 too. Doesn't matter.
I'll just give you this, and then there's a friend.
There's 6 there. Oh, we need some sound. We need some music, people.
Oh, they are fun bags.
I was going to say I know the Halloween song. Out of all names. I know.
No, that's like the.
But if y'all can run it, we'll do that. Come on, sister,
Oh my god, everybody's going hands over here.
No, I don't.
I've seen your name.
You actually got a reference.
Oh, I think someone made
You ready to start?
In Rochester, you guys are having way too much fun.
Where are you going, Matt?
I love it.
I don't know. Yeah, you should.
Yeah. Come on. No.
I don't know, some of you are even crying.
Yeah.
Like, I do have my clothes on, my face isn't running off. I don't know what y'all are saying, but I love it.
I don't think I made
Let's get that like 7 or 8.
I don't think I could.
Oh, the rest of the
We need a few more players.
online center.
Unless some are taking time off for church training. Remember, it's not cool to go after you're 19. It's just
Yeah, I think
uncool.
so.
All right, Lily, are we good? All right. Here we go. Are you ready? Yes. All right, here we go. The nurse knows that the most abundant cation in the blood is what? Excellent. Good Good job. We'll talk about why that's so important here. Coming up. Nice job. Who put Rainy in there? Seriously. Approximately 2/3 of the body's total fluid exists in which fluid? Intracellular, intravascular, interstitial, or transcellular? All right, intracellular. I'm thinking some of you didn't look at your study guide PowerPoint. Was there an exam in another course going on? I don't know. Just saying. Okay, nice job, Rainy and Xavier. Passively moving water from an area of lower concentration to higher concentration is known as what?
I just think the D is like
All right.
so incorrect. That was
Lower concentration to higher concentration.
Oh.
But it is moving water, okay? So always water is associated with osmosis.
I know, I didn't read it either, I just read from
Make sure you read the questions. Okay, now Rainy's losing, so what's up with that? You should know these answers. Which elevated cation is most likely to cause a cardiac arrhythmia? Oh, y'all better know that one. That's kind of a critical one to know. Okay. Ooh, Austin, look at there. 20 points.
That's
Sneaking
good.
up. Edema in a patient who has right heart failure is facilitated by an imbalance in which kind of pressure? There we go. I like this one. Hydrostatic. The heart is the pump. Julianne was like, oh, how many times did I hear you say that? Heart is the pump.
Oh, yeah, and you're
The most abundant intracellular cation is what? Intracellular. Potassium. Okay, good. Good job, guys. Make sure you have those straight, otherwise you're going to be in trouble. This whole stuff can get really complex. Pressure generated by the heart during the contraction is... Y'all better get this exactly right. Otherwise I'll know you were talking. Lord have mercy, I just said the heart is the pump and it's the hydrostatic pressure, okay? So, goodness gracious. Okay, here we go. Fluid balance in the body is a result of what? So now we're thinking about balance.
It's going to be all of them,
Yes, all of the above. So, I'd like to see that nice spread. That means you guys probably knew that. We'll talk about how each one of those plays into it here. Oh, nice job, Sean. Which of the following is not a source of potassium? All right, pasta is really not a really good source of potassium, unless you've laced it with something uncool. Okay, Xavier out there. So 0.9% saline solution is what kind of solution? Good, it's an isotonic solution. So that is exactly the concentration of plasma, okay?
I have a question.
All right, nice job. Okay, who's playing Xavier 2? See, I wonder who's nice job in Rochester. Way to steal the identity. Got some identity? Going off, Rochester. Yeah, good job. All right. That's pretty sneaky. I like sneaky, actually. I'm kind of a rebel. I don't know if y'all noticed, but okay. All right. Here we go. All right. You guys are wound. I think the sugar was out in full force before class. So things that you need to know about the location and movement of water and electrolytes. So this is kind of fundamental, and if you've not had it already in A&P, you're really going to want to pay attention to it here, and you'll impress your teacher over on the other side. How's that? So intracellular fluid is within the cells. So every cell in your body has fluid in it, okay? And that makes up most of the fluid, which generally is water. It kind of breaks down to H2O, and it's found within cells. Super important you know that, okay? Extracellular fluid is the fluid outside the cells. So that's in between the cells, right? What they float around in, what's cushioning them, okay? That's what they float around in, right? And that's really important to know because, well, we'll get to it here in a minute. I don't want to get ahead of myself. There are 3 divisions of extracellular fluid. So interstitial, and that's the stuff I was talking about that they're kind of floating around in. Intravascular, so that is actually what's inside the vessels. And transcellular, which are things like synovial fluid, spinal fluid, those kinds of things, okay? We are primarily going to focus on interstitial and intravascular for the extracellular fluid in this course, okay? So the composition of electrolytes within that solution, in the intracellular portion, the prevalent cation is potassium. The prevalent anion is phosphorus. In the extracellular fluid, the prevalent cation is sodium, and anion is chloride. Okay? So how do they move around? How do they get from one place to another? Because they need to, obviously. So movement of water and electrolytes happens by several different... Got a question?
They don't match.
The one online didn't match this one?
You just that last slide.
Okay.
This one matches.
Okay, so just move to this one. Okay? All good? Don't panic. All is good. Active transport, diffusion, osmosis, and filtration. It's going to be absolutely critical that you understand the differences between all of these, okay? So active transport is the movement of molecules, which are anions, proteins, different kinds of things, against a concentration, and that requires energy. So if you're moving against a rock, obviously you're going to need to have energy, right? So think about active transport as using energy. Now diffusion, on the other hand, is very passive. And we think about that moving from high to low. There's no energy required. Osmosis is always the movement of water. Always the movement of water. And how we get it to move against the concentration gradient is by osmosis, and we'll talk about how that happens here in a minute. And then filtration is like movement across a membrane under pressure. So you can think of kind of a garden hose effect, so pressure, okay? So now we'll look at each one kind of separately. Active transport, move against a concentration gradient, and an example, a really good one, is the sodium-potassium pump. Remember, if we have positive electrons, they want to fight with another. They want that homeostasis. They want to be equal. So you can't shove too many of them on one side or the other, same way with negative electrons. So we have to move it by energy, okay? So here we're going to see how that works with just a little teeny tiny YouTube if it's working, and it is.
The sodium-potassium pump is an active transport mechanism. 3 sodium ions bind to the protein channel, and an ATP provides the energy to change the shape of the channel that in turn drives the ions through the channel. One phosphate group from the ATP remains bound with the channel. The sodium ions are released on the other side of the membrane outside of the cell, and the new shape of the channel has a high affinity for potassium ions, and 2 of these ions now bind to the channel. This binding again causes a change in the shape of the protein channel, and this conformational change releases the phosphate group on the cytoplasm side. This release allows the channel to revert to its original shape, and as a result, the potassium ions are released inside the cell. In its original shape, the channel has a high affinity for sodium ions, and when these ions bind again, they initiate another cycle. The important characteristic of this pump is that both sodium and potassium ions are moving from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration. That is to say, each ion is moving against its concentration gradient. This type of movement can only be achieved by the constant expenditure of ATP energy.
All right. So that'll come in quite handy here in a bit when we talk about, let's see, no, don't go. Don't go again. Bye-bye. I have a bad habit of doing that. Okay, here we go. Okay, so know that that's an example. That's not the only example in the body, but that's the most common, okay? And then when we think about simple diffusion, so movement of molecules from a high to a low, so that happens all the time. And if you think about like oxygen, how it gets from the blood out, intravascularly into the cells so that they can breathe, right, and get rid of CO2, that's a wonderful example of simple diffusion. And facilitated diffusion, it needs a carrier molecule to move across that gradient. So let's see how the facilitated diffusion works.
In the process known as facilitated diffusion, a special carrier protein with a central channel acts as a selective corridor, which helps molecules move across the membrane. These special carrier molecules that form the protein channel bind only to a specific molecule, such as a particular sugar or amino acid. Once the molecule binds to the carrier protein, this protein helps or facilitates the diffusion process by changing shape and moving the molecule down its concentration gradient through the membrane into the cell where it is released. Facilitated diffusion is similar to simple diffusion in that both involve movement of molecules down their concentration gradient, and this movement is carried out without any input of energy. However, in facilitated diffusion, the movement of molecules will only take place if it is facilitated or helped by a special protein carrier in the membrane. Facilitated diffusion can occur in either direction depending on the concentration gradient. If there is a higher concentration of the particular molecule inside the cell, the same carrier protein would then transport the molecules out of the cell.
Okay. No craziness going on there. All good, all done with that. Okay. All right. So now we've talked about active transport, simple diffusion, facilitated diffusion. This is an example of simple diffusion, and if you think about putting just a lump of sugar, and let's say it was colored, okay, just like in the picture, if you put it into water and it slowly dissolves, okay, it's slowly over time going to be totally diffused into that last container, okay, because it wants to be equalized everywhere, so those are going to move away from each other, and so that by the time you end up getting to the last one, you really are going to have it all over, okay? And so that's simple diffusion, and that also happens within the body. Does not require any energy. So this one is kind of interesting in that it's the movement of water against a concentration gradient. So what we have is we have a semi-permeable membrane. Protein and water are the two things you want to think about when we talk about osmosis. Albumin, which we've already talked about, is the primary protein in the body, right? And so that's what's on one side of the semi-permeable membrane. So now what I want you to think about that semi-permeable membrane as being a capillary, okay? And so what happens is that protein, albumin, is very large. It can't get through that membrane at all. It stays on one side because of its size, okay? And then the properties of proteins are that it's able to pull water back. So when you look at osmosis, and let's say you have 5% albumin on this side, and you have 10% here, and the rest is water, okay? What's going to happen is the higher concentration is going to pull so that they become equal, okay? And that's what's actually happening in the capillaries. And we have a really nice video, however she pronounces capillary is capillary, remember? Capillary. So you'll begin to see this. But when you look at this little model in your book, really think about albumin and water. So if you have a question on an exam, and it's really focused on moving water, and it's really talking about albumin or proteins in the body, okay, you better start to think about osmosis, all right, and what's happening. So this is kind of just a diagram that talks about hypotonic, isotonic, and hypertonic solutions with red blood cells. We're going to talk more about that in a minute when we talk about fluid balances, okay? So how do we make sure we have balance? We talked about we need to have homeostasis, right? So things need to be able to move against concentration gradients, with concentration gradients. We need to make sure we're managing potassium, we're managing sodium, and some of our negative cations as well. And so we need to be able to figure out what the heck, how are we doing this? Other things we need to think about is how do we maintain balance just by actual input? And so we think about thirst, okay? We also think about eating, okay? So about 50 to 80% of fluids come from food, so it's not the primary source of fluids, but it does provide some fluids. So now if you go back to nutrition and you think about people who are malnourished or our older adults who have a propensity for dehydration, right? They have a decreased thirst mechanism and a decreased satiation, right? So they don't get as hungry or want food as much either. So we have problems with balance, okay? We need to think about the hormones that are involved with balance and where they come from and what will happen. And that will also play into pharmacology, because when we have problems or problems, what happens is we need to control some of those hormones that are causing problems, and we can do that pharmacologically by focusing on one hormone or another, okay? And elimination. Obviously, we need to have regular elimination through urine and defecation. But if we have problems either with constipation or how about acute renal failure? So that means we're not getting rid of the fluid we have in the body. We also kind of have the other problems where we have constant emesis or we have diarrhea, okay? And so we need to think about balance, okay? So hydrostatic pressure, what's the pump?
The heart.
The heart. The heart is the pump, okay? So if we have heart failure and the pump isn't working, we're going to have problems with balance, okay? We're also going to have problems in other areas because the heart kind of starts what happens at the capillary level as well. So blood pressure generated by the heart during a contraction. So think about it like you had one of those I can't remember what they're called, but you push them and then they push air into a fire, right? Bevel, what's it called? Yeah, that thing. So you're constantly doing that, right? And it's pushing air out, right? About the other end. And so you're thinking about the heart doing that very same thing. It's pushing with pressure and it's pushing out what needs to go out, okay? Osmotic pressure. So remember that the pressure, it is a pressure that's caused by plasma proteins, albumin, okay? It pulls the water back into the capillary, right? Albumin cannot get out, right, of the capillaries and venous system because it's too big, okay? So it stays in, but guess what's happening with the heart? It's doing this. So it's pushing fluid out, okay? So we have to figure out how can we get that fluid back in? Otherwise, every time the heart pumped, all of our fluid would simply go out of our body. Not cool, right? So we need to get it back in so we can send it back to the heart so we can push it out again, okay? So those two work together. So next thing we need to think about is, so the amount and the direction of the movement is determined by capillary hydrostatic pressure. So that's in the capillaries. Plasma osmotic pressure. So that is actually in the plasma itself, so the composition of the plasma. And when I say that, I want you to think about, does this patient have enough albumin? Okay? So if we know they don't, we have nothing to pull back all that fluid. So what do you think is going to happen? What might we see? Anybody? How about in Rochester?
Edema?
Edema, exactly. So if we don't have enough albumin, when that happens is we push it out, there's nothing to pull it back, now we have edema, okay? Interstitial hydrostatic pressure. So here we're looking at, remember that fluid that the cells are floating around in, right? So it also has a hydrostatic pressure, okay? And the interstitial osmotic pressure. So the composition of albumin that's out there in that fluid as well, okay? Will determine which way everything's moving. So this is a diagram that I want you to become very, very familiar with, and we'll talk about it here again, but we're going to watch this wonderful little movie here. She does a really great job.
I write pretty much all day, every day.
Get Grammarly. No. Is it cool?
Yeah.
Capillary fluid exchange.
All right.
Capillaries are where fluids, gases, nutrients, and waste are exchanged between the blood and body tissues by diffusion. Capillary walls have tiny pores that allow water and small solutes to pass between the pores into and out of the blood vessel. The capillary walls do not allow proteins to pass through.
There you go. Okay, one thing I want to point out. In Rochester, can you see my little pointer here on the screen? Yes? Right here are all the cells, okay? So remember, every cell in our body is within reach of a capillary, okay? So we have the arteries going, and we also have the veins, and so the blood from the heart is running through this artery. It's going out into this capillary bed and getting over here into the venule, okay? But what's happening in between here? This is where all the cells get their oxygen from, and this is where they get rid of all their waste products. So if you think about simply oxygen and carbon dioxide, right? So there's a transfer. So it has to be close enough to a capillary to get rid of that, so when we take it back, the vein goes back then and brings blood back to the heart and back to the lungs where it can be oxygenated. We can remove the carbon dioxide by breathing, right? And so think about every cell interstitially. That's the interstitial fluid, is all this fluid right in between all of these cells here, okay? Hopefully that is helpful. And go.
Two forces control movement of fluid through the capillary wall: blood pressure, which tends to cause water to move out of the capillary, and osmotic pressure, which tends to cause water to move into the capillary. At different locations in the capillary bed, the net forces will influence the direction of fluid movement. At the arterial end, blood is under high pressure because it has just come from the heart. Blood pressure is higher than osmotic pressure of the blood. Fluid is forced out of the blood, leaving solutes behind. This increases the salt.
Okay, so what's happening at that arterial is, again, blood pressure coming from the heart. It's filtering, pushing, right? Pushing all that water out. So that's what the green stuff is. What's left behind are the things that are too big to be pushed out. So with that fluid getting pushed out are things like CO2, things that are small, okay? So they're getting to all those cells that, remember, are floating around, those little dots all here. This is the cells, okay? So this is water being pushed out, which increases the concentration, right, of all those larger molecules like, which one? Albumin, okay? So what's going to happen at the end is going to make sense. Now this little thing here is hydrostatic pressure is greater than osmotic pressure. You want to know that. At the arterial end, hydrostatic pressure is greater than osmotic pressure. So there's more pressure pushing out than pulling in, okay? For those of you taking notes, I'll just wait just a second before I turn it back on. This is the basis for everything. So if you don't get this concept, you're going to be absolutely lost.
It's greater than
All right. Okay, less typing.
Is it positive?
Hydrostatic pressure and osmotic
As
pressure.
fluid moves out of the blood. At the capillary end, blood pressure is relatively low because blood has been diverted from the arterial to many capillaries. Osmotic pressure is relatively high. Solute concentration is still high because fluid has been pushed out into the tissues at the arterial end. What's left behind in the capillaries is a...
Okay, so in the middle, right there, where it's the widest, right, it's pretty much equal, right? So the pressure that came from the big poof, right, is now sort of, and another example I thought of when I was at home, I was trying to think of what kind of examples I could use. So if you have a hose and in your yard, right, and you turn it on, that's the pump, right? And so the hose is fairly wide, so that's like an artery, right? Now you have a sprinkler, one of those ones that does this thing, or one of them that shoots across, and you're hooking it up, so it gets smaller, right? As it flies out of there, it's smaller, right? So that's what's happening at the beginning where those green signs are. But remember, the water falls down, whoosh, right? And so what's happening is the pressure isn't, the higher the pressure, the farther it'll go, right? But it's going to fall back to earth at some point. It's going to become equal when it's at its highest point, just like the capillary. And then all of a sudden, there's no more hydrostatic pressure big enough to sustain that height of that sprinkler, so the water is going to start going down. Okay? Make sense? All right. And so now she's moving on to the end of the capillary, where osmotic pressure, OP, is greater than HP. So the water now is falling, okay? And so what that means is we have lots of albumin, the concentration is high, it's pulling that water back to earth from the sprinkler. Okay? Does that make sense? Here we go. We'll finish it up.
high concentration of solutes that includes salt, plasma proteins, and blood cells. Because osmotic pressure is higher than blood pressure, fluid moves back into the capillaries, and the blood becomes dilute once again. 90% of the fluid that was pushed out due to hydrostatic pressure at the arterial end is brought back into the blood system at the venule end through osmotic pressure. The other 10% enters the lymphatic vessels, which eventually merge with the circulatory system so that the fluid is returned to general circulation. Midway along the capillary, where blood pressure is lower, the two forces, hydrostatic pressure and osmotic pressure essentially cancel each other out, and there's no net movement of water. Solutes now diffuse according to their concentration gradients. Nutrients like glucose and amino acids and oxygen diffuse out of the capillaries, and wastes like carbon dioxide diffuse into the capillaries. Red blood cells and almost all the plasma proteins remain in the capillaries. Only small substances leave. Here's another image of a capillary bed, which shows how extensive the lymphatic system is, which explains why it so effectively returns any tissue fluid that wasn't returned at the venous end. In this video, we've looked.
So now if we also think about what would happen if our lymphatic system was damaged. So people with lymphedema, right? Their lymphatic system is damaged, and so now they can't get that 10% back. So the rest of the stuff is working. They could have perfectly wonderful nutrition. They could have enough albumin, but the lymphatic system isn't working, and so now we have lymphedema, which is different than this kind of edema we're talking about with tissue. Any questions on this particular diagram? Rochester? I would say be ready to look at this diagram, have a list of these things, and know where they go on an exam. Maybe know which, if hydrostatic pressure is greater at the beginning, greater at the end, where it's equal, etc. Sit here.
Like the element that decrease out into the interstitial fluid, like since you can't go back in the capillary, does the lymph bring it back to the circulatory system?
Albumin is not pushed out, it's too big. So it stays, so this albumin, these little dots, you don't see any of them out here, these are the nucleuses of the cells. Albumin is much too big, it's too fat to get out, okay? So it stays in, which is what causes the hydrostatic pressure. Does that make sense? So there isn't any out there in the interstitial fluid. Yep.
Is the hydrostatic and osmotic pressure equal right when it turns into a capillary?
Right where it gets in the middle.
The middle.
Okay? So if this is the artery and this is the venial, so arterial venial, right here where my head is actually where there's just equal pressure. Okay? Nothing is really moving by hydrostatic pressure or osmotic pressure. It could be moving just simple diffusion, right? Or facilitated diffusion. It could be moving by other ways, but it's not moving by hydrostatic pressure or by osmotic pressure. Okay? Great questions. Anything going on there, Rochester? All is good. All right, we're moving on. So this is just another picture here of how this works. So we're talking about filtration that comes from the heart by what it does when it pushes. Okay, so the aorta pumps, it sends it out into the system. It's sent throughout the body with pressure. So when you think about high blood pressure or hypertension, okay, which is a pathological problem, what is happening, okay? At the level of the capillary, the pressure makes a dramatic change, okay? So at the proximal or closest end, it's highest in the arterial, and at the venial end, it's the lowest, okay? And if you talk about which kind of pressures, we're talking about hydrostatic and osmotic, okay? Same diagram, same concept, different diagram. So the balance consists of fluid intake and absorption. We've kind of covered a little bit about that. Drinking and eating and thirst and habit, okay? So anytime that is out of whack for whatever reason, say it's an older adult that just doesn't have that thirst mechanism that they had and they're forgetting to drink or they're not provided with fluid, say in a nursing home or something, we can have problems. Eating, so if a person goes on a fast, okay, we need to think about what is actually going on in the body, how, and the pressure that it puts, and I don't mean pressure like hydrostatic, but the problem that it can cause for the kidneys or the heart. So fluid distribution, The tonicity of compartments. So what do I mean by tonicity? Anybody here in the cities, Rochester? Tonicity. How about if I said concentration of compartments? Okay? So tonicity is simply a concentration. So if you see that word, tonicity, think concentration. And we'll look at the tonicities of isotonic, that's where tonicity comes from, hypertonic, and hypotonic solutions, okay? Now those solutions can be body fluids, but they can also be things that we treat patients with that come in nice little bags, okay? We're going to get it down what's happening in the body first, and then we're going to start treating some patients. Fluid output. So what kind of system are we talking about when I say fluid output? Anybody? Urination. So renal. We're thinking about the kidneys, okay? So if you have kidney failure or any problems with the kidney, okay, all of a sudden we're going to be out of balance, okay? So if we have acute renal failure, what's going to happen to the body? Are we going to have more or less fluid? Anybody? So somebody said less. What's your rationale? It's absorbing? Okay. So if we have a renal failure so that the kidney no longer produces urine and gets rid of it, so basically I've got a little clamp here in my hand and I shut the kidney off, so we're not peeing anymore. What's happening to the rest of the body? Is it filling up like a big balloon? Yeah, because we can't get rid of anything we put in, okay? So the body actually fills up more with fluids, okay? So the kidneys, the heart, and the lungs work together. They are kind of this little triad. And if we have a problem with any of those, we are going to have a problem with fluid and electrolyte balance, okay? That's not to say that the other organ systems aren't important, but when we're looking at fluid balance, if we have a problem in our kidneys, we're going to have a problem with our heart. We're also going to have a problem with our lungs. Guess what happens when I plug up the kidneys? Guess where all that fluid goes? Straight into your lungs, right? It's going to go back up through the heart, and it's going to back into the lungs, which is pulmonary edema, okay? And that's caused by heart failure. Yeah, Xavier.
That was like dialysis.
That's why people have to have dialysis. Exactly. People who need dialysis also are on very, very strict fluid restrictions. They get very, 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 very thirsty. I mean, they can have just very limited amounts of fluids because they're not getting rid of any. Now the problem is, so they're getting very little fluids. Their body is still working to some extent. So the buildup of toxins in the body that aren't being released out through the urine are also happening. So the concentration, if we have very little fluid and we have a lot of toxic stuff, is very hard on those people who are on dialysis, which is another reason we really need to treat our diabetics, right? Because when they have high glucose concentrations, it's killing those kidneys, okay? It affects lots of other things too. Good point, Xavier. Everybody in Rochester okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So, fluid output. We also have insensible losses. So that would be like fever. So if somebody has a fever for any length of time, they're losing fluid all the time. And if that fluid is not replaced, we're going to have issues, which is why some of our patients who do have those fevers also develop dehydration, and we're needing to treat that, okay? Now let's go the other way, and let's think about urination, and let's think about defecation. Let's talk about that. So if we have constipation and we can't get rid of stuff, we're also going to have problems, right? Because we're not getting rid of fluid that way. But let's think about if a person has diarrhea. okay? All of a sudden, we have this massive loss of fluid, all right? So now the body becomes dehydrated because we've gotten rid of so much fluid in the body that we're not able to replace it at the same rate without help, okay? So remember, again now, we have that nice triad of the heart, the lungs, and the kidney, and so we also have to kind of include in there also defecation, so the GI system to some extent, okay? Yep.
I just had a quick question for clarification.
Yeah.
In the reading, they had fever as an example of a sensible fluid loss, not insensible.
Oh, that's right, because you can see it. So insensible is breathing.
Yeah.
Yep. Thank you. Yep. I just wanted to talk about fever, so I just went off on a tangent. So anyway, anytime there are any of those problems, make sure that you're thinking about your patient, not just in how they look on the outside, but what is actually happening on the inside, because that's what we have to treat, okay? Either with some type of pharmacological or some type of fluid enhancement, okay? Hormones, okay, so now we're tripping into a new area. Have you guys covered hormones in A&P yet? Excellent, okay. So, your teacher should, one of us should get extra points when we're first. So hormones. So hormones are also responsible for what happens at the kidneys, at the lungs, and at the heart, okay? So we have hormones that are being regulated by the hypothalamus, but released at the pituitary, okay? So now what happens if we have some type of brain damage, or say we have a pituitary tumor, right? So if everything's fabulous, everything's fabulous. But if they have a problem in any of these areas, and we'll talk about which hormones come from where, but I'm just saying, can you see how fluid and electrolytes kind of are the mainstay of how we live, okay? Kidneys, so the kidney is also responsible for releasing hormones that regulate fluids, okay? So now if we have kidney damage or kidney failure, we have a failure to produce hormones, so that's also another problem. Not just can we not release urine, or we produce too much urine, but we actually have other problems as well. And then cardiac, so our heart actually releases hormones. It's not just the pump, right? It actually releases hormones that are actually counter-regulatory to the two other, but we'll get into that right now. Okay, so in the posterior pituitary, there's ADH, antidiuretic hormone, okay? I think of antidiuretic hormone as the no-pee hormone, okay? So that's what it does. When it's released and it attaches to receptors on the kidney, it makes the kidney not produce or get rid of, I should say not get rid of, as much urine, okay? What's happening to that fluid if it's not being released in the urine? We're reabsorbing it into the body, okay? So, what happens if, let's say, antidiuretic hormone is increased, okay? The no-pee hormone all of a sudden is increased. What is happening to the body fluid? Are we getting more or less? More. Is that really good for somebody who has hypertension? No. All of a sudden now we have the heart having to deal with more cardiac output. We have more fluid going through there. What happens to the heart? It's getting tired. That left ventricle is constantly trying to push that extra fluid out. Now all of a sudden we have left-sided heart failure. Okay? So again, that triad. All right? So next, if we think about the adrenal cortex, which is the top part of the kidney, it releases aldosterone, which also works in the renin-angiotensin system. Remember, angiotensin works from the lungs, okay? So again, our wonderful little triad there. But aldosterone, so when I think of aldosterone, I think of sodium. Okay, sodium. Aldosterone is sodium. So, wherever sodium goes, water always follows. Water and sodium are absolute best friends, okay? So if we reabsorb all this sodium, right? So we're not peeing it out, we're keeping it because we have aldosterone. What's happening to the fluid in our body? More or less? More, okay? So if we have more fluid, we're going to do exactly the same thing that we did when we had more ADH, okay? Also, when we have more aldosterone, we have more sodium. It kicks in renin and angiotensin, which also work. We not only have more fluid to deal with, guess what happens to the arteries? Okay? So the blood pressure goes skyrocketing, okay? So these all kind of work together. And then we have wonderful anatriuretic peptide. Now that is released from the heart. And that actually helps get rid of sodium. So that's a good one, particularly when you're having problems with retaining sodium. This one actually is counter-regulatory to aldosterone.
What's it called?
Anatriuretic peptide. A is for atrial. So A and P. Anatriuretic peptide. There's also a B natriuretic peptide, which you'll probably learn more about in your junior year. You don't have to know about it here. But when you think about a natriuretic peptide, either A or B, if the heart muscles are stretched because of too much fluid, it releases this B natriuretic peptide, which we actually collect blood, run it in the laboratory, and we can see how bad the congested heart failure is. In other words, how much fluid and damage we're having by the amount of B natriuretic peptide. Okay, so you'll see that one coming along later. Right now, just focus on A. It's released from the heart. It's a counter-regulatory, helping the kidneys get rid of sodium and water. I would also know this very well. That's what I said. This one is so complicated because everything affects everything else. So when you get your questions on the exam, read them. Draw diagrams, up, down. Before you even start your test, write what your hormones are so that when you get to the question, you're not like, oh crap. And then I see little erase marks. Wait, just joking. Go with your gut. Write stuff down before you get confused. It really will help you, okay? Also, your PALS people are really good at this, so they're going to help you put things back in, next week when they meet. They're going to help you put these things together. But really important to know what's happening with all those hormones. So now we're going to kind of think about this. Again, this is basically just to summarize, chunk and check. Fluid intake. Remember, thirst is the primary regulator of intake. Thirst, primary regulator of intake. So what's happening to our older folks? If that's the primary drive for intake, that doesn't work, okay? So we have to make sure that they know that it now needs to become more of a habit, needs to be a reminder, okay? And whatever we can do to educate them about fluid intake and how it affects their body without a bunch of medical talk, right? But it is super important, okay? For older adults, we're really looking at, minimum would be 1,500 mLs. And maximum, we'd like to see about 2,500. But I want you to think back when we were talking about thicket. How many teaspoons would it take to get even 2,000 milliliters of fluid in someone? A lot. Yep.
Can you repeat those numbers for older
Sure.
adults?
So older adults, 1,500 to 2,500 is about what we recommend. Okay?
Thank you.
Because remember, their kidneys are also going through some changes, so they have a little bit more trouble getting rid of extra water. So where for you guys, if you drank 3,000 on a day, it's not going to be that big a deal. You're just going to pee more, right? For them, they might retain more, even without pathological problems, okay? But if they do have chronic diseases like hypertension or kidney issues, kidney failure, whatever, they would definitely have trouble with more fluids. So that's about what we recommend. But the whole thing is to say it takes a lot longer for them to get those fluids and to remember to have those fluids. Let's think about pediatrics, although I don't like to very often because they're not my peeps. But do you think that their system can handle very many changes between not having enough and having too much? No. And really, it's very unlikely that they would get too much, but too little is really going to be an issue. And remember, it's going to be even a tighter kind of range, okay? So hydration, because guess what? They have arterioles and venules and capillaries, and they have sodium and potassium and all of those things, and it's all managed exactly the same way, okay? So we really need to be careful with fluid balance in our very, very young and our very, very old, okay? Distribution, so I want you to think about what are the compartments. If I said compartments, although it's written here, everybody out loud, what are the compartments? Intra and extracellular. Think about at least 2 compartments within the extracellular. Intravascular and interstitial. Okay? So, let's see, somebody in Rochester. How about Ryan and Julia? So, interstitial fluid. Tell me where that's at.
It's inside the cells.
That's,
Oh, no, sorry. Interstitial is between the cells.
so yeah, so that's what it's floating on. It's in between the cells. Perfect. Perfect. So, now that we know that extracellular, okay, has these 2 compartments of vascular and interstitial, if we took a sample of blood and we measured what was in there, it is a representation of what is in which compartments. So go back into your brain and think about the pictures I've shown you. And we're going to take a needle and we're going to go into the vein and we're going to draw blood. We're going to take it to the laboratory, okay? And we're going to run some tests. Let's say we're going to run a sodium. It's a representation of sodium in what compartments? Okay, here we go. The cities. Let's see. Let's do Austin and Molly.
Do you mind repeating the question?
No. Okay, so now we're going to draw blood from a patient, okay? So we have a needle, we're going to go straight into the vein, we're going to draw a blood sample, okay? And we're going to take that blood sample to the laboratory, we're going to run a test on it. We're just going to say it's sodium, okay? It is a representation of sodium that is in what compartments?
Vascular.
Good, because we know we're in the vein, vascular, good guess, great. You're looking a little like you might not know the other one. Now think about it.
Molly.
We're going to have a steal. We're going to have a steal in a minute.
I'm not sure.
Okay, in the cities here, steal, Xavier? Okay, said intravascular, so what's the other?
Extracellular fluid.
Okay, the extracellular is the overarching, so we have 2 smaller compartments.
Interstitial?
Interstitial, exactly, perfect. So when we take a blood sample there, we are measuring what is between the cells because that tonicity or concentration is going to be exactly the same as what is in the veins. Now when we get to the end of this and we talk about what we're going to treat patients with, it's going to be incredibly important for you to understand what you put in the veins is going to go and sit right next to the cells as well. It's not going to stay in the vein, it's going to go out because they're no different, okay? Except for, because we have that semi-permeable membrane, albumin is the one that's not out floating around because it's too big, right? But the fluid, the water, the sodium, we can get out there, okay? Even glucose, we have dextrose, okay? It's hard, right? Another minute or 2, and then I'll let you go after this slide, okay? So we're chunking and checking. So now hormonal influence. What do we call antidiuretic hormone? No pee hormone. So if we have more of it, we pee less, okay? If we pee less, we have more fluid running through the heart, the kidneys, the whole thing, okay? So now let's say a person has fluid overload, okay? They have lots of fluid, and we're trying to get rid of it, and we have a pill, okay? What kind of pill would we focus on what hormone here? We could maybe focus it on the antidiuretic hormone, right? So we could make that not work as good or totally cancel out by filling in the receptors on the kidney so it doesn't have anywhere to go, right? We could also work on making it not be produced up in the pituitary, but that's generally not what we do, okay? So if we fill up the receptors on the kidney, antidiuretic hormone can't work, right? And we pee more, okay? So understand how that works, and that's why I call it the no pee hormone, because it's easier for me to remember what's happening. If there's more of it, we're more no peeing. If there's less of it, right? So it's just easier for me to remember, okay? Also remember, aldosterone works on what cation? Sodium. What loves sodium? Water. Wherever sodium is going, water will follow. If we have a lot of sodium being released in urine, a lot of water will follow, okay? Again, we can use pharmacological agents to focus on aldosterone, to tamp down the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which would help reduce fluid, which would help hypertension, okay? So you'll see medications for hypertension that often work on ADH and aldosterone, okay? Anatriuretic peptide in Rochester. Nick and Lily, tell me what anatriuretic peptide does. What's its name to fame?
It excretes sodium.
It does what?
It causes it gets rid of sodium so that it also.
Right? So if we pee out more sodium, it gets rid of more sodium. So what we're thinking about is it actually is that counter-regulatory mechanism to aldosterone and what's happening with ADH. Okay? Fluid output, very simple. Think about the kidneys and the shape that the kidneys are in. We also need to think about skin. If we have somebody with massive burns and they're unable to keep the fluids inside their body, we're going to have a massive shift of fluids, right? Because it can't contain it in the compartments. All of a sudden, we have, this patient is super critical because there's no way to keep their fluids in, okay? Big problem. And you'll talk about those burn victims and things when you get more into your junior and senior year. But this is the basis for the fluid shift and the problems that we have. We need to, the skin also is where we would get rid of those insensible, I mean, we do have some perspiration all day, even if it's not fever, okay? The lungs, when we breathe in and out, and the GI tract. So if we have diarrhea, we're going to have some massive shifts of anions and cations that are found in the GI system. And I think that's all I have for you. Go have about a 15. You probably need it. Your little brains are... I will check and see if I've heard from the Rain Man. The Rain Man. You guys don't know the Rain Man. Okay. Yes, sure.
Couples costume.
No, intravascular is part of exercise. Interstitial and interlap.
Don't even try.
See this arrow? It's so popular. You can go back and forth.
I'm gonna eat it. Last minute. So do you know what?
No, I said we're gonna draw blood from it, right? So if we draw blood from it, patient has what? What compartment? So it would be interstitial and does that make sense? I probably didn't say it right or not. It is interstitial and intravascular.
I went from putting them on the.
Okay, I mean, like you said, that's
Dude, I saw that in like last.
make sure. All the same, okay? So that if I say we're taking a blood sample from the vein,
Like Sarah.
you know, it's both of those compartments, like within ECF.
Okay.
And then blood plasma is like connected tissue and all the no one's plasma. That's what it's there. So let's go. Okay, good. Thanks for asking.
I just I can understand
No way. You know what?
it's not even, I'm not always because there's a question about but there's like a
there wouldn't be a blank page. How about if
she always is like
and honestly, that was the way I was a med tech, right?
yeah,
I have a minor in
always.
so honestly, God, it was like so much stuff to remember, but they sounded alike. They were actually, before I read all this, I'd be like, they were making this up. I would write stuff down, stuff, then I would take the test. When I read the question, they'd be like, oh crap, now I just like didn't tell us. Because like when I took my food, so like I spilled out hard drunk and then so I was like, and I couldn't tell you like covered in like and then
Yep.
there's a way to go to town.
Whoa!
Maybe two. Yeah, go to the one.
Yeah. That's what the share
Increased.
maybe just
So would you do me a favor though and shoot me an email so I'll remember?
Yes, sir. Yeah, that's like the core of I like
No, this is more in the
I
don't. So this is like the.
Oh my God, no.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I give her.
I don't like no.
Like out, but I don't give her. I go by it. Is it getting below the screen? It's not.
We're gonna talk about this during election, but okay. So when we get to this part, I want for you to ask me any questions that I don't. What's happening in here is the concentration is lower inside the cell. It wants it, right? So what is it gonna do? I don't have enough, so what am I gonna do? I'm gonna want some, right? So I'm gonna get some sodium, I'm gonna get some water, I don't have enough water, I'm gonna get more. So if the concentration is lower,
Like high.
because this wants to be, so that's what blows it up.
Or not really, but
Yeah, it will make it better. First of all, or for you to kind of.
First of all, I'm not judging.
This particular part about what's happening with water.
I swear to God, this book.
Think about what happens from a solution point. So let's say we have just plain old water, okay? It's got nothing in it. But our cell has what in it?
He never listened.
Alright, all that kind of stuff, right? So when it goes into the cell, the water around it wants to be equal with what's in it, right? So what does it do?
That wasn't even close to my first.
is the stuff inside the cell.
concentrate. I think you've made it really complex. I'm going to simplify this whole thing for you. You've made it really complex. I'm going to make it easy. Okay?
Really funny.
I promise. But if I don't, you come see me and we'll make it happen. I did not hear from Rainey, but you guys are sending your. Did you guys watch Jane the Virgin?
Yes. Yeah.
So I was at the end. I don't want to give anything away, but you know, Rogelio, he loves his social media, so he's making it go. So the more emails you send to Rainey, we will be able to push that deadline out. Anyway, I just finished, so it's pretty wonderful. No spoiler alert.
How are you?
I'm so excited. So I sent out an email.
Yes.
I want everyone to watch the video prior. I know I saw there was
I just did the interview.
Okay. The thing is, Carrie would be super good at it. But she's like, that's her style. I thought somebody made up questions. And I was like, did you order this? And I was panicking. We did, just so I could have them. Yeah, more pauses. I asked. It's how much rent. I see. So I want to go on your offering. What about she's probably hyperkalemia? And it's annoying. Yeah, it's hyperkalemia and hypercalcemia.
Yeah.
So yeah, since in hyperkalemia, if you think about, I always have to draw it. Donna's the mark. Yep. So there. They do. Okay, so I have to draw it to one. So normally, do you have a calcium? No. Me and Jasmine, observers. So so I'll just do like 1, 2, 3. Okay. For the outside of it. But now when you hyperkalemia, someone would say, how did they get so all of this outside? And last and you're not behind. I don't think anyone's done.
We're only doing potassium and sodium.
I do potassium. No, yeah, I know.
Hyperkalemia is
Oh, there is. So it does feature hypercalcium and magnesium. The one you're looking at,
but we're not going to do
but
that.
that's yeah.
I mean, you're not going to be tested on this.
I wouldn't worry about the calcium and potassium and sodium.
We just have enough to worry about.
You don't need to worry about calcium and magnesium.
Oh, why? Nice. That's it. Is that enough?
I saw that right though about potassium and hypo. You're messing up the distribution. You have cardiac You're saying. At the beginning, we're like in simple terms.
It's in simple terms. They cause it either way. There's one kind of thing I think that gives it away, and I'll talk about that when we get there. Yeah. That would be my look for.
Yeah.
I just you object to.
Fine. I'm leaving that. You will probably not go over some stuff on this slide. Like the fluid intake, fluid distribution, hormones, output. We might touch on it, but I think you really sodium and the it's complicated, but when I highly recommend drawing it out.
I would.
Yeah. Calcium or potassium? Yeah. Hyper. So when the sodium and potassium, right, those are two channels to allow them to pass. I have saying out there. Am I just like we're normally asked about topic based, not like specific things, right? Really maybe
So Rose and
I was gonna walk tomorrow and yeah. Yeah. So they hypo.
yeah, see, they're just saying we're guys.
And that's so it doesn't like urinary. Has that always like I just well, that's actually so yeah, there's like the ones are like right on the just fine. I think it's maybe it's not high sugar because or not. Like a high salt and getting like straight that's kind of funny. That's what I thought. Yes. And so we're trying to get because I feel like that's where relatively it is. That's the goal. If you're now you die from dehydration, you're eating speech fibers.
Okay, big peace out. Okay. I have to. Oh my God.
Dude, sour stick, oh my God, in the longest time, but those are probably my favorite. It's like something where like I need
Okay, all right, everybody back? Well rested? Minds totally ready to receive more information? Yes, that's what I heard silently. Okay, so this is just kind of another example, another chunk and check that you can use to make sure that you understand what's going on. So here we have homeostasis, which means everything is working. The heart is working, the lungs are working, the kidney is working, everything is where it's supposed to be. They're getting the right amount of fluids. Everything is happening, okay? So all of a sudden down here we have homeostasis is disturbed by a decreased sodium concentration in the extracellular fluid. So that means now we have maybe a sodium concentration of 130. I will say you do need to know the reference values for sodium and potassium for the next exam. So all of a sudden you have decreased concentration in the extracellular fluid. So now we have osmoreceptors are inhibited. There is a decreased NO-P, okay? Decreased thirst. So if we have decreased no pee, then we have increased urinary loss. Okay? So then we come up here and we have water losses, which concentrate the ECF and the volume is reduced. Okay? We can go the other way and do increased sodium, and we're going to look at kind of the same things. So make sure you can look at those diagrams and say to yourself, do I know what's going on? And if you can't, find a peer, find one of your PALS coordinators. If you do not know this, you are going to be in trouble, okay? Just simply because you won't be able to, you won't know what's going on with your patient in the case study. You're not going to see this picture necessarily. Remember, this class isn't about memorization. It's about knowing what's happening, okay? All right, now we've talked about the normal person. We're moving into imbalances. So you needed to have normal under your belt before we talked about imbalances. So now we're going to talk about fluid. Okay, fluid. So basically water, okay, and of course it's mixed in with blood and yada yada in the plasma, in the intravascular area, and it's also in the interstitial area between the cells, okay, and in the cells, or excuse me, extracellular is just in the vascular system and interstitial, and then what happens when we have fluid volume excess. And we referred to some of those in the examples that I talked about. So now we're going to kind of see what we do about it as nurses, or how we know. So extracellular fluid volume imbalances. So there is a ECV, so extracellular fluid volume deficit, is also known as hypovolemia. I would know those two terms are the same. So hypovolemia, so hypo is decreased, right? So that means there is decreased vascular volume. That can happen when we have abnormal loss of body fluids. Let's see, Rochester. Let's look at Fahima and Nick. What kind of abnormal body losses might we be talking about?
Vomiting?
Sure, lots of vomiting. Anybody in Rochester have another one?
Diarrhea.
Diarrhea, okay, here in the cities. Think of another one. Diuretics, so increased urinary release. What else?
Hemorrhage.
Yeah. Excessive bleeding. So people who come into the emergency room, right, who've been in a car accident, right, and all of a sudden they're bleeding, will experience hypovolemia too. So it can be the whole amount. So not just the water portion, but the whole amount, okay? So the red blood cells, the whole thing, they will experience hypovolemia and likely hypovolemic shock, okay? Inadequate intake. So again, these could be our older folks. Or a plasma to interstitial fluid shift. And that might be someone who's had a burn, okay? We're not going to really worry about that quite so much. Do you have a question, Shannon? Okay, all good. Everybody with me in Rochester, just holler out if you don't. Okay, so what are the clinical manifestations? What does this patient look like? And this is always what helps me go, hypovolemia. What does this patient look like? So it's related to the loss of vascular volume. You will often see also CNS effects. I will tell you, whether it's an increase or a decrease in fluid volume, the brain is likely to experience it first. So you will see CNS changes with patients who are experiencing any type of fluid imbalance. So it's very important for you to have a baseline neurological assessment when you are with a patient, which is simply orientation, all kinds of, do you know where you are, all kinds of stuff like that. And kind of what they look like. You might do Perla on their eyes or whatever. But the reality is, if all of a sudden that starts to shift, you need to start going through a number of things in your brain right away. One of or two of those things would be either fluid volume increase or decrease. So the treatment, what are we going to do for these folks? We're going to replace it. Make sense? Right? Now, I really didn't talk about losing any sodium. I didn't talk about losing any potassium. Right? In this case, we're simply talking about too much fluid, okay, or too little fluid, all right? So at this point, we simply are going to replace with a balanced IV solution, and that word balanced is isotonic. Iso means the same, okay? Isotonic solution. We just want to give them more fluid. That's it. Okay? Yeah.
Is there any reason you would ever give a patient like a hypotonic or a hypertonic solution?
Oh, you betcha. We're going to talk about that very quickly. Yes. So, we're going to give them more fluid. All right. So here we're going to talk about hypervolemia. Okay? And so that's fluid volume excess. All right? So if they take too much fluids, okay, so there is like water poisoning or whatever, don't see it really very often. Abnormal retention of fluids. Why might we have an abnormal retention of fluids? We talked about that earlier. So here in the cities, how about Anne and Catherine?
Can you repeat the question one more time? If there's
Yes. Okay, so abnormal fluid retention. We're getting too much fluid. Why might that be happening? What could cause that?
antidiuretic hormone.
Antidiuretic hormone. Perfect. Great example. Another example, Anne? Thoughts?
I was just saying like an increased amount of the antidiuretic hormone.
Okay, so we have to have increased no-pee hormone, right?
Yes.
Okay. What else? Anybody here in the cities want to steal? Isabel?
Constipation.
Constipation could, essentially, yeah.
What would the aldosterone do?
Aldosterone, remember that's associated with sodium. So we could, but remember with sodium also goes water. So if we had an increased aldosterone, we would increase our sodium, right? Which would increase volume. You're exactly right.
So would that be this?
Yeah, yeah. Also, if we had acute renal failure, okay? So lots of different things can cause abnormal retention of fluids. So clinical manifestations related to excess volume, again, you're going to see CNS kinds of things. You're also, now with excess, you're going to have bounding pulses. You've got too much fluid. So you could hear crackles in the lungs that are related to too much fluid, okay? You could also maybe have some edema, all right? So this person is going to have, they might have jugular vein excess, so you might see the jugular vein here, okay? So now what we want to do is remove fluid without changing the electrolyte composition. We don't want to move sodium, we don't want to move potassium, we don't want to move anybody, and we don't want to do anything with albumin, but we need to get rid of fluid, okay? So here we might increase, or use maybe a pharmacological agent to decrease ADH, so we pee more. Maybe we don't have as much ingestion of salt. So that's our hypertension folks on sodium-restricted diets. These are just some nursing diagnoses that go along with. And so if you kind of try to think about the picture of that patient, so you have decreased cardiac output with hypovolemia. These folks generally have thready pulses, okay? They're They might have some turgor kind of issues. Hypervolemia is a little bit easier to see a patient, actually see them. These folks generally have problems breathing. Again, it's due to the fluids that they can't get rid of, so they're building up in their lungs, okay? So there's an impaired gas exchange. The impaired skin integrity can come from edema. Activity intolerance comes from that problem with impaired gas exchange. And ascites is the buildup of fluid in the peritoneal cavity, okay? That's what ascites is. Okay, so now what are we going to do? Remember, we always have to assess first, okay? We might be looking at INOs, okay? So we know we have a disturbance of some kind due to our assessment. And so are they getting too much in, not enough out? Where is the problem? So we actually have to initiate input and output. Have you guys looked at that in lab yet? Yes? No? Yes? Okay. Monitor for cardiovascular changes. Okay. So you're going to listen to the heart rate. You're also going to be listening to respiratory changes. Again, you're going to be looking for crackles if you think they have too much fluid on board. Neurological changes is almost always an issue with too much or too little. Daily weights. So if somebody has an excess of 2 or 3 pounds, right, in a couple of days, do they have more fluid on board or less? More, okay. And so this probably isn't due to like too many cakes. This is probably too much water on board, okay. And so generally these are the folks that have hypertension that need some diuretic kinds of things, okay, or are congestive heart failure folks. And so we get, they have problems in that triad, okay? So daily weights is another way to tell. You can also tell if your implementations have been successful by those weights going back down, okay? And obviously a skin assessment as well, okay? So if it's edemic or if it's kind of flat and, you know, doesn't pinch up really good. Okay, so now we're going to start talking. We talked about volume. Sometimes we have volume problems with electrolyte problems, okay? But we're going to kind of think about this a little bit separate, and then we'll put it all together. So we're looking at sodium. What happens when we have a problem with too much sodium or too little sodium? So hopefully you know that because sodium has this wonderful relationship with water, we probably are looking at some volume problems just because of the relationship between water and sodium, okay? So when we have hypernatremia, oftentimes we will have a volume deficit. Hyponatremia, a water excess. And then if we have actual clinical dehydration. So a lot of times you might just mention dehydration because maybe your bun and creatinine are elevated a little bit, maybe the hemoglobin is up a little bit. But true clinical dehydration is really an extracellular volume deficit. So we have not enough volume, and we also have hypernatremia. So too much sodium. So 149, 152. So too much sodium and too little water. Okay, so now you're thinking about the relationship of the fluid. Yep.
I'm just wondering, like, what would cause somebody to have, like, a sodium excess without, like, the water, you know, like, where their volume wouldn't be affected, but the sodium would. they're always like following each other and stuff?
With sodium, more than likely you're going to see water associated just because of that relationship. Sometimes it's not very much. Like let's say it's just kind of a passing kind of thing. Like let's say it's not clinical dehydration, but maybe you're just a little dehydrated from a day of activity, not enough water, that kind of thing.
Okay.
You might see just a little bit,
Okay.
but you're not going to see like your 152s and your 129s without some kinds of shifts generally. Okay? So when we have a hypertonic solution, okay, so we have too many sodium ions, okay, in the fluid, and we put a cell in there that does not have enough, it's going to pull the water out of the cell in order to try to make the water equalize, okay? And that's why with a hypertonic solution, it pulls all the water out. Remember, we have sodium on the outside. Guess what goes with sodium? Water. It's going to pull it out. Okay? What happens to the cell? Okay? It looks very icky. Now, this is a red blood cell, but remember the cells in the interstitial fluid? So all the cells, right? They are going through the same problem because that fluid is the same fluid. Does that make sense? So that's where it gets difficult for students to understand that those two compartments within the extracellular fluid are the same, right? Remember, sodium can go back and forth easily, okay? So these are red blood cells, right? But let's say we had epithelial cells, a skin cell. It's going to be dry and flaky. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, good. So now we have isotonic, which means it's just cool. 0.9% sodium, hallelujah, everything's fabulous. Okay? We're not going to move any sodium around. It's just magnificent. Okay? All the cells in the interstitial fluid, the intravascular fluid, all the same, having a great day. That's where we want to be. It's just moving in, moving out at the same rate. Now we have a hypotonic solution. We don't have any sodium ions floating around in the fluid. Okay? So now all of a sudden most of our sodium ions are inside the cell. So what happens? Water follows sodium. So what happens? It pulls it in. The cell says, holy mother, I got too much. Whoosh, blows up. Okay? So, it can. I mean, honestly, if you take them, it does. So, you have to kind of think about this in the opposite way that you want to. It's not the cell that's hypertonic. It's the fluid the cells are sitting in. Xavier, does that help? Did that make it more simple? Yeah. So, don't overcomplicate it. Think about the relationship with sodium and water. Okay? And then think about who follows who. And so when you have that piece of paper originally, okay, and before your test, you write this little diagram. Hypertonic water, isotonic, hypotonic, one crenates, and maybe you even do this H2O thing. So you don't get confused. This is an easy place to get confused. Any problems in Rochester? Yes? Okay. Call them on you next. Yes?
So it would be that sodium, say like hypertonic, would be if sodium left the cell, or if there's just an excess of sodium outside of the cell?
We're just talking about the fluid around the cell.
Okay.
So how it got there could be any number of reasons.
Okay.
So the fluid around the cells could be from, remember when we talked about before, it could be ingesting too much sodium, right? Any number of reasons, but it's the fluid, not the blood cell, okay? So whatever would change the vascular system, things we eat, things we drink. So if you drank a whole bunch of distilled water, right, it's going to change the volume, right? It's going to change that concentration of volume around all your cells, right? And it's going to be more dilute, So it's going to be hypotonic because you drank so much water that didn't have sodium in it, right? Does that make sense? Okay. Whew. These are tough, guys. So sodium plays a major role in volume and concentration. So like I said, rarely are you going to see one or the other. With potassium, it's more common to see more things without volume changes. But because of that relationship with sodium and water, they really kind of do both. Remember also that sodium plays a big role in generation and transmission of nerve impulses. So you might have hyper-reactive reflexes, or you might have muscle contractility, and acid-base. Ray's going to go over acid-base next week, so you can talk a little bit more about it then. Just know that it will play a part. And that's because of sodium's relationship with potassium, but we won't go there. Hypernatremia. So an elevated serum sodium occurring with a water loss or a sodium gain. This is where we really get crazy, right? It can be either one. It's all about concentration. If I have a tablespoon of water, right, and a tablespoon of sodium or salt, and I mix the two, we got a really high concentration, right? But if I take that same teaspoon of sodium and I stick it in the ocean, nothing happens, right? So you really need to think about water loss or sodium gain. So that's how hypernatremia could happen. It does cause hyperosmolality. So osmolality is simply a measurement of the particles in solution, okay? Now I know we're talking about hypernatremia, but something else that's hyperosmolic, okay, would be an excess of glucose, right? So if we had too much glucose on board, you're also going to have an elevated osmolality. So all it is particles in solution, all right? But sodium, when that happens, we cause cellular dehydration. Why? The fluid is hyperosmolic and water follows it, so it's going to pull it out of the cell. Simple, very easy, if you just remember that relationship. Primary protection is thirst. And the thirst mechanism is located up in the hypothalamus. And that's how the hypothalamus helps regulate the no-pee hormone, ADH. That's how it's related. Hypothalamus tells the pituitary gland, do we need to turn off or turn on? What do we need to do here? Because the baroreceptors in the body are talking, right, to the hypothalamus. So it's saying we have enough fluid, we don't have enough fluid, what's up? Okay? Whew! All right. So this is just another chunk and check of the same information here, okay? This also will tell you, so we could have a water deficiency with hypernatremia, we could have a sodium deficiency with hyponatremia, or that isotonic normal, okay? And over on the other side, we could have a volume excess, and it could be due to any of those reasons, okay? So you got to be able to understand both ways. Water excess, sodium excess, or water deficiency and sodium deficiency. Know which ones belong on either side of this normal right here, okay? If we don't have enough water, a lot of times we'll see the sodium level go up. It's just a question of concentration. We could also have too much sodium and that could cause it, or obviously isotonic. Oops. Just joking. Oh, Lord. Don't do it. Okay. Hypernatremia. Manifestations. What do these folks look like? Too much sodium. So if you're thinking about the relationship of sodium And fluids, you're thinking about, what do these people look like? If you have too much salt, okay, so let's say you went to, let's see, Annie's down here, and you had a shake, and you had a wonderful cheeseburger, and you had an extra large order of French fries, okay? And what goes good with French fries? Salt, right? You are thirsty, right? And it's because of the salt. So the same thing would happen if you had soy sauce on your Chinese food. It's the sodium that's making you thirsty, okay? And so immediately what's happening is the baroreceptors in your body are talking to your brain and saying, hey, we need to feel thirsty. We need to get a little more fluid on board, okay? So these folks generally look dry, okay? So dry mucous membranes, dark concentrated urine, decreased skin turgor, okay? So it may be that these folks have clinical dehydration, right? Could also mean they're just dehydrated. And we're not going to get into, you saw it in your book, that's the only reason I put it in here. We're not going to get into that craziness of talking about it. You're not going to get exam questions that have to do with the difference between or anything like that. So don't spend your whole time trying to figure it out, okay? Just know that it can happen, right? So generally these folks have labored breathing as well. They can be kind of agitated. What did I say happens up here? CNS kinds of things happen. So agitation, impaired level of consciousness. We could have seizures, coma. I would hope you would catch it before then. And again, we could have a volume deficit, would go with the hypernatremia. And we could also have some orthostatic hypertension, and that's due to just, if those folks are laying down and that they're not really feeling the effects, right? The heart and all of that works pretty good, and the vessels, but when they sit up and all of a sudden there's that little bit of change in gravity, these folks definitely will feel that orthostatic hypertension.
It's orthostatic hypotension, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Sorry.
Is it mentioned orthostatic hypotension or orthostatic hypertension?
I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be hypotension, but let's leave that off there for right now. I'm trying to go through it while I'm thinking and talking to you guys. Yeah, Claire.
I also had a question about the slide about different
orthostatic
volume. It was like
guys,
graph.
Excuse me?
It says like above each of the boxes, it says like extracellular contraction or extracellular expansion. No, what does that mean? Because like I thought the
extracellular, the whole space will either contract or get bigger. So obviously, if you have fluid volume excess, then that expands to contain it, right? Does that make sense?
Oh, yeah.
And so if you don't have enough, it'll shrink up a little bit. And that's why I'm thinking right here, if we have excess, sodium excess, I'm thinking it is hypotension, but I'm not going to swear on a stack of Bibles till I can think about it. So, hypernatremia, this is just one of those little kind of picture things. You might see a real low-grade fever. If you don't see a low-grade fever, they're just going to be dry and warm, okay? As opposed to cool and clammy, right? They're just going to be warm and dry, okay? Again, we talked about being irritable. Remember, the body is trying to get fluid. So one of the ways is to drink it. The other way is to reabsorb it from the urine, okay? So increased fluid retention will also cause the veins and stuff to contract, which will increase the blood pressure. This patient could also see some peripheral edema. However, you know, I would say honestly with that edema, you're not going to see it without other situations going on. So I would really look more at that dry, flushed skin, irritability, decreased urine output. Remember, we want to keep all the fluid on board. Dry mouth. These folks are drier. These folks look like they are dehydrated. Hypernatremia, more dehydrated. Yep.
So since they're more at risk for fluid deficit, then how does that relate to having like edema and fluid retention?
That's what I'm saying. You wouldn't probably see it without, because the sodium is playing with other things in the body, you might see that, but we're not going to go there. So, yep. This is just something I took off the internet that helps you remember. So if you think about fried and think about fever, restlessness, increased fluid retention, increased blood pressure, and decreased urine output and dry mouth, you're going to be okay. I'm not going to ask you about the edema. Yep.
Would you expect to see skin triggers since they're like dehydrated?
No, you would have decreased skin turgor. Yeah. However, I will say that turgor is the last sign of dehydration. So these folks are really dehydrated. When you start to see tinting, they've been dehydrated for a long time, and hopefully they're getting hydrated before then. I actually have found some little old folks on the units where I've worked that have actually had real tents, like standing up tents, and we had to call the physician immediately and get fluids. And how the nurses didn't see that before we got there was a little concerning. But the physician did bring his med students in to see that tenting, because you don't see it very often like that because it's the last thing to see. So he wanted his med student to actually see that tenting. Yeah.
So if it increases blood pressure, would, on the previous slide, would it have been orthostatic hypertension then?
Yeah, it could be. If you have enough increased fluid retention.
You probably wouldn't have your blood pressure.
So it probably is more hypertension, but we're not going to go there either.
What is the difference between orthostatic hypo and hypertension?
Hypotension is when they don't have enough fluid, okay, in their veins and all of that. Hypertension is when everything is going and it's under extreme pressure, okay? So it goes through the kidneys with pressure, it goes through the veins with pressure. When your blood pressure is really low, the filtration in your kidneys is also very low, which can be very damaging to your body and especially to your kidneys. Okay?
So how would orthostatic hypertension present, like with the orthostatic hypotension?
When they're up and moving, they might have increased blood pressure versus a drop. Where if they were laying down, it would be perfectly normal.
Yeah.
So it's only with movement, okay? And if they got up, they would experience more hypertension with movement. Honestly, I've never seen it, so doesn't mean nobody's ever seen it. But again, I think it would have to manifest under certain conditions. Yep.
So, can you explain the orthostatic part and then also what is hypertension? You get that from like too much fluid or no?
Hypertension is a disease process that happens with the veins and arteries, the play of hormones like aldosterone, renin, angiotensin. So if the body, for whatever, has an increase in those, like let's say there's a damage to the kidney, and all of a sudden we have a decreased no-pee hormone. We're going to increase the fluid. When we have too much fluid on board, we have too much pressure in our veins, okay? It's sort of like taking your finger on the end of a garden hose and turning it on. If you let it go, just normally that hose stays the same. But if you put your finger on the end of it, right, then all of a sudden you have too much fluid in that hose, and so it gets bigger, so the pressure is higher, okay? Does that help make sense? It puts more work on the kidneys, it puts a lot more work on the heart because of that overload, okay? And so it can cause more damage. If it's untreated, that's why they call hypertension kind of the silent killer, because it's putting more pressure on the veins in the brain, it's putting more pressure on the kidneys, it's also putting more pressure on the heart. And so you'll see, and then the more damage that you have, the more medicines or other kinds of things that you have to be on because the damage gets greater.
And orthostatic means standing.
Yeah. From sitting to standing, from one that's flat to standing. It's a change. Okay? And so when you have to take orthostatic blood pressures, they'll have you do it when the patient is laying down, when the patient is sitting, and when the patient is standing up. And what they're doing is looking for differences. Okay? Sorry if I confused you guys by the blood pressure thing in the edema. Hopefully, and there aren't any questions that you would be confused by. Some of the nursing diagnoses are risk for injury. Again, risk for fluid volume deficit, which means hypotension if you have a deficit. What happens in the heart and the kidney? So basically, I just told you. Okay? So we have that damage. If we do not have enough pressure going through the kidneys, so we don't have enough volume, then we don't have enough filtration to make urine. Okay? So we can have a problem. If we have too much fluid, we have damage in the heart and the vessels, the brain. There's a risk for electrolyte imbalance, particularly when we're talking about volume, because generally sodium does make a play in the volume one way or the other. Okay? If we're looking at other electrolytes that would be affected, what are your thoughts? So sodium plays with what? To make something we use at the table? Chloride, okay. You'll also see it play a little bit with potassium, just simply because they're the two major cations, okay? There are, again, those potential problems up in the brain, central nervous system for seizures and coma. It will lead to irreversible brain damage, so that's why I'm like, you got to act quickly. So, treat the underlying cause. So, primary water deficit, so they don't have enough water on board, and that's why they have hypernatremia. You're going to replace the fluid orally or with isotonic solutions or hypotonic solutions. Because what happens if you have a hypotonic solution? It's going to do what? Hypotonic solution puts water back in the cells. A dehydrated person's cells are like this. Okay? And we want to make them puff up again, right? So we need to put water in them. So that hypotonic solution, so half normal saline, so 0.45% saline would be helpful in that case. Okay? We also could just replace with more fluids. Okay? Again, what happens with people when they sometimes think about, particularly students when they're thinking about management of fluids, is when you have a hypotonic solution, it's not like you can use too much of it and then all of a sudden put on a hypertonic, and you play around like on your little machine until you get it dialed in. No. Okay? You treat it until you've treated the condition and then you stop. Okay? So people, even with just a regular IV of isotonic solution, can get fluid overload by simply running too much water into their body. Okay? Which could be very dangerous for them. Okay? Excess sodium, you're going to dilute the sodium with free IV fluids. We're going to get into it at the end here too, but we have several isotonic solutions we can choose from. One of them is what physiologically is the same as our body, right? So 0.9%. Also, there's lactated ringers. Okay, so that is not going to cause the movement of any of the ions to go anywhere. Okay, it just simply replaces fluids. Now, D5W does not use sodium. Okay, and so that little bit of extra free water that it has helps those cells puff up without actually giving the patient more sodium. Remember, dehydration can be associated with too much sodium, okay? We don't want to give them any more sodium, right? So the choice for them would be an isotonic solution without sodium. And the only one of those is D5W. Dextrose in 5% water, okay? And we've actually, on the floor I'm at right now with juniors, we've had 3 patients who've been had to be changed from saline to dextrose 5% because their sodium values went up, okay? So it does happen, okay? Monitor carefully. Again, if you go too high, what's going to happen is you're going to see more CNS effects. So you would be down here seeing effects in the central nervous system, and then you'd go through the period when they were just right, back into more problems on the other side. So IV fluids have to be managed extremely carefully, okay? Again, so this is why this is here, okay? So hyponatremia results from a loss of sodium. So it could be any fluids containing sodium. So we could have emesis, we could have diarrhea, we could have fluids like drains and those kinds of things, or from too much water. It's all a concentration issue. Okay? What happens? These folks get confusion, irritability, headaches, seizures, and coma. Again, CNS stuff. Hopefully I don't have anything crazy on this one that makes us go off into the weeds. So, lethargy, headache, confusion, apprehension, seizures, coma. So it's like not really a whole lot different, okay? Except you won't really see those symptoms of being dehydrated. So the dry mucous membranes, all that kind of stuff. So that might be a key if you're looking in a case study. Does this patient look dehydrated? Do they have dry skin? Is there a turgor issue? So, caused by water excess, we need to have some fluid restrictions. So generally, we don't treat these folks unless it's extreme with any kind of IV fluids. We simply try to restrict fluids and let nature and your body and all the hormones and kinds of things fix it. However, if we are looking at bigger things, we can treat, and we'll talk about that here in a second. So why does it happen? So sometimes, again, an abnormal fluid loss. If it happened from an abnormal fluid loss, like let's say diarrhea or emesis, we probably would use a fluid replacement with sodium solution. So here, we might use just normal sodium. We also might use, probably would just use normal saline for the most part. Drugs that block ADH, which is also known as vasopressin. So if we block no pee hormone, we're going to pee more. Okay, makes sense. And that's going to change concentration. Don't worry about these drugs. Just understand that there are drugs that are available that would block that vasopressin. Remember when I taught that would be one way that we could change volume is by changing how much we pee. And no pee hormone is one of them. So diagnosis is, again, a lot of these are CNS related, confusion, risk for injury due to confusion, electrolyte imbalance, and severe neurological changes. Now we're going to talk for a bit about potassium. Those are the only 2 electrolytes we're going to talk about for this class or that you're actually going to be tested on. So don't focus your attention on magnesium, phosphorus, calcium, etc. You're going to get those when you get to be a junior. I think this is quite enough to have to deal with when you've never had to deal with any of it before. So we're going to talk about hyperkalemia and hypokalemia. So potassium in general is, again, the major intracellular cation. Most of them live in the cell. Most of them live in the cell because they don't have direct access to the heart. Okay? If potassium in excess has access to the heart, we have some real problems. Okay? It is also necessary for muscle impulses, cellular growth, cardiac dysrhythmias, are the major problem with too low or too high of potassium. And potassium is fairly tightly regulated in the body, okay? So 3.5 to around 5, 5.2, something like that. Remember, reference ranges change around the communities. But what you don't want to see is if you see a potassium of 7.5 or 8, it is inconducive with life, okay? So it's not like it can go up a lot, okay? Also, potassiums that are low, 2.2, 2.1, not really inconducive with life for very long, okay? So it's tightly regulated because of the cardiac issues. It also will have play a role in acid-base function when you guys talk about it next week. So where does potassium come from? Actually comes from fruits and vegetables. Salt substitutes contain a lot of potassium, okay? So if you're having your older folks who are on sodium restrictions use salt substitutes, we need to make sure that they're not getting too much potassium, okay? Potassium medications like supplements. Stored blood. Why stored blood? What happens to blood after 120 days?
It does.
Okay, if it's in a bag and all those cells are dying, what's being released?
Potassium.
Potassium. You cannot use old blood on babies, okay? Their hearts could not take it, so generally in blood bank, when we would get requests for babies, that blood has to be very, very new, okay? So you'll find out when you do mom-baby about that, but you definitely don't want to have a lot of potassium for babies. It's regulated by the kidneys. Potassium ions are passed through the urine, just like sodium and those kinds of things. So if you have kidney damage, oh, guess what? You're probably going to have some potassium regulation issues. And usually what's happening in the kidneys is potassium or sodium is being released in excess of one or the other. So it's kind of a trade-off between those two positive ions in the kidneys. Hyperkalemia, so high serum potassium, which is caused by impaired renal excretion. So for whatever reason, the tubules are not able to get rid of that potassium. Or there can also be a shift. Remember, if we have a big shift from intracellular to extracellular, even a huge crush injury that caused a lot of damage, right? And so we had a lot of cells being damaged that released a lot of potassium, so we could see an elevated potassium. Not like a burn victim, but you could see an elevated potassium for sure. And again, massive intake. Those pills are about this, no, they're not that big, but they're big. So most people don't want to take a bucket load of those, and there's no really good anything that comes from it. So the most common reason for hyperkalemia is renal failure. One of the things that happens in dialysis is that potassium is taken off, okay? And so they use potassium as a guide, potassium and sodium, but they will use potassium as a major guide to how often these patients need to be dialyzed because they can't get rid of those ions, and those ions can actually cause death, okay? Manifestations, what do these folks look like? So believe it or not, you can get cramps in your leg from too much. So people will say, oh, you must be low in potassium, eat a banana. Well, it can be too much, too little, or it could just be you ran a mile. So that's one of the things. Weak or paralyzed skeletal muscles, I would say probably you're going to see weak muscles more as a regular kind of thing. Abdominal cramping or diarrhea. So you can see a lot of the same manifestations in hypokalemia as you did in hyperkalemia. And so one of the biggest changes, and I would highlight this, underline it, or whatever, is this abdominal cramping and diarrhea, because you probably won't see that in hypokalemia. So the GI effects are more in the hyperkalemia. Okay, huge cardiac dysrhythmias. Hyperkalemia, Again, this is a little guy, so muscle cramps, weakness, paralysis, drowsiness, decreased blood pressure, EKG changes, dysrhythmias. Yeah, abdominal cramping is kind of big, and oliguria is another one that you'll see more often in hyperkalemia. Remember the relationship, you're not getting rid of those, so a lot of times the reason you're not getting rid of the potassium ions is because you're simply not peeing, okay? You all know what oliguria is? We talked about that. Yes, you do. So you can look at these nursing diagnoses here. I want to get to the case study. So how can we deal with this? So eliminate any kinds of additional kinds of supplemental potassium. So if we have that potassium substitute in salt, as salt substitutes, we want to get rid of that. An increase or elimination of potassium, diuretics. If we have too much potassium on board, K-exalate is one of the things we used to use, and that kind of was an enema that we would instill, and then that would attract the potassium ions and then cause the patient to get rid of them through stool. I did see some reports, we're not really using it much anymore, but you should know it. You might see it on your NCLEX exam. Diuretics, so we can also have potassium-sparing diuretics, okay? So we know that thiazides and loop diuretics deal with sodium, and we also deal with potassium at the same time. So we can have potassium get really low. But when we have diuretics that save potassium, these folks can also get hyperkalemia. So we have to monitor that. And obviously dialysis also treats it. We need to force potassium from the extracellular fluid back into the intracellular fluid. I've done this once in the ER. So we could use IV insulin or sodium bicarb. It's really an emergent kind of procedure. The patients actually have to be on a cardiac monitor, have a crash cart nearby. So if someone has a inconducive with life kind of potassium and it's too high, we can, and so what that's doing is making all that, remember that potassium, it takes energy to get that potassium back into the cell, okay? We have to force it from where it's floating around getting contact with the heart back into the cells where it doesn't. This is how that works. You don't need to know it. I just had a student ask me one time and I thought there is absolutely no way that I am going to memorize that. Reverse membrane effects of elevated extracellular fluid potassium. You can also administer calcium gluconate by IV. Again, this is something probably you wouldn't do on the floor, more in an ICU situation. Hypokalemia, so low serum, it can be caused by increased loss via the kidneys or the GI. Okay, either one. Increased shift of potassium from the extracellular fluid into the cells, or whatever reason. Could be a medication, could be whatever. Dietary potassium deficiency, which is very rare. Folks that won't eat fruits or vegetables or not, it's very, very rare. Magnesium deficiency, as you'll find out in your junior year, there is a relationship between magnesium and potassium. And metabolic alkalosis will also cause hypokalemia. So again, cardiac manifestations for both hyper and hypo. You'll see weakness. We already talked about weakness. You'll also see weakness of the respiratory muscles. However, you'll see a decreased GI motility instead of increased. These folks might also have some hyperglycemia. So there's just a little picture. We call him Sick Walt. So what do we do here? We have potassium supplements we can give orally or IV. Always, 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 always give potassium IV or in a bolus form diluted. Never, ever, ever, ever give it undiluted. Never give it as an IV push or as a bolus undiluted, okay? So when you're giving potassium, you can tell that this is a big issue, okay? Because remember that really tight range? So there's no going back when you go over. Like, you're in trouble again very quickly. Should not exceed 10 milliequivalents per hour. And this is basically when we're doing kind of prevention kind of things. Okay, so this is how we're going to treat these folks. Now, we're not going to go into a lot of things. We're only going to concentrate on a few. In fact, on your test, you're really going to want to concentrate on isotonic. We're going to talk just a smidge about hypotonic and hypertonic, but really we're going to focus in this class on isotonic, because I think you need to get that down before you start doing a bunch of other kind of crazy things, okay? So purposes of IV fluids are maintenance, or when oral intake is not adequate, or we can use them for replacement. So we can use them for sodium, potassium, magnesium replacement, so it's a replacement of an electrolyte of some sort. We can even have phosphorus in them, those kinds of things. So think about replacement and maintenance. So the types of fluids are categorized by tonicity, okay? So remember, these are the fluids everything's going to float in, okay? We're going to put it into the veins, into the vascular system, which also is going to affect the interstitial fluid. So those are going to be the same thing, the cells and the blood cells, all the same, okay? So the tonicities, we've already talked about them, isotonic, hyper, and hypo. You need to make a very thorough assessment. I have also seen where accidentally the wrong kinds of fluids have gotten ordered by the physician. So you as a nurse are the one that's actually going to hook it up to the patient. So if you don't know, guess what? You're going to be sitting next to them in a lawsuit because you should have known that is part of what a nurse should know, is when not to hook those things up. So I did have a student one time ask me, why do I need to know when it's the doctor that's going to order it? Because you are going to actually administer it, monitor it, and take care of it. So you need to know. So what is part of the assessment? So age, we talked about that, most at risk, old or younger. Past medical history. So what kind of things do you think we're looking in a past medical history when we're thinking about IV fluids? Or electrolyte? Rochester, how about you guys? Let's see. Dayton and Bryan. Past medical history that's pertinent to IV administration. Think about the triangle.
Renal failure?
Okay. Cardiac failure, right? So congestive heart failure or just heart failure, renal failure, any kind of lung problems, which make these folks more at risk. Okay, good. Environment, so really is more about what they're taking for supplements, what they've been around, those kinds of things. Diet, what's their normal diet like? In other words, if this patient is getting a lot of potassium in their normal diet, we don't want to put them on a potassium-sparing diuretic because it's just going to go higher and higher and higher, right? So diet does play a role. Lifestyle, medications, other electrolytes or electrolyte problems, and you might want to take a peek at some laboratory issues before you ever hook anything up. I've also had doctors order magnesium on patients who needed it yesterday, but now today are normal, and so not a cool thing to hook them back up for another nice big liter bag when they already have enough. Neck vein distension, so again, that's going to really be talking about their volume, right? So if there's too much volume, you're going to see neck vein distension. Skin turgor, not enough volume, right? And so if you're putting volume into somebody who already has neck vein distension, you are really going to be causing an issue, okay? Daily weights, again, we talked about how that also corresponds to volume. Intake, fluid, and liquids. Output, can they pee, can they poop, are they sweating? My stepdad at one time had a third-degree burn over 3/4 of his body, so he could not sweat there. So he would be at risk, right? So we really need to take a look at those kinds of things. Drainage and fistulas and vomiting also will change those electrolytes. Laboratory studies, edema. If this patient has edema already and you're hooking them up to put more fluid into them, again, they're going to be at risk. Lung and heart sounds, if their lungs are crackling and you're putting more fluid in their body, they could be at risk, and their temperature. So isotonic solutions only expand the vascular and interstitial fluid. So basically the extracellular fluid, it just expands it, fills it up, full of the same stuff it's supposed to have. So these folks should have some kind of deficit, or we should be maintaining because they can't get fluids. Maybe they're NPO before surgery. Maybe they just came from a surgery and their bowels aren't quite working yet. So this affects the intravascular and interstitial fluid, and it just fills it. Doesn't make anything move. We're not talking about moving any sodium, moving any potassium. None of that business. There's no net loss or gain from the intracellular fluid. So remember those little blood cells, the ones that were all cremated or the ones that were blowing up? None of that. Just the one that's floating around, happy, happy, happy. Okay? It's ideal replacement for just volume deficit. Okay? So hypotonic solutions are more water than electrolytes, obviously. Again, concentration issue. Remember, pure water is a hypotonic solution, and it breaks open or lyses red blood cells. So when you're using a hypotonic solution, think about that cell that's blowing up. You want to make sure this patient needs it, and it's stopped when it's over. So water will shift. It will shift from the extracellular fluid and move into the cells, making the cells swell. By osmosis. Water moves. Water moves. Osmosis. Water moves across that membrane. Okay? So if you have too much fluid or not enough fluid, you're going to see it in mentation, right? Those CNS changes. Hypertonic solutions initially expand. So in the beginning, they start to fill up, and then they raise the osmolality because of the concentration, which are particles in solution, okay? However, then what happens? If you have that hypertonic solution, right, and in the beginning it expands, however, if we get too much of it, then it makes those cells pregnate, right? So requires frequent monitoring of blood pressure, lung sounds, and serum sodium levels. I would say hypertonic solutions, depending on the type of patient, could be more dangerous than hypotonic. But honestly, any IV fluid could be dangerous if you didn't know what you were doing, okay? So these are the types of, this does not go across, okay? This does not go across. So intravenous solutions are 0.9%, normal saline or sodium chloride or NS, those are all the same thing, lactated ringers, and 5% dextrose. I guess this one does go more this way than the next one, but think about these separately as well. Increase intravascular and interstitial space without moving fluids outside the extracellular space. The next one is true for both NS and LR. So they are both crystalloid solutions, which means they just contain crystalloid anions that break apart. That's all that is, okay? And it increases volume in both the intravascular and interstitial space. Okay, so basically that's ECF with minimal volume expansion, okay? And the very last one is the one you really want to know, and that's normal saline is the only solution that can be administered with blood products. Ever, 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 ever. Okay? So you're never going to hang blood with LR or 5% dextrose. It's always going to be normal saline. Nursing implications, so there you're going to assess hypervolemia, shortness of breath, distended neck veins. So remember, hypervolemia is volume excess. Hypovolemia, you're an output less than 30 mils an hour, means the kidneys are shutting down. Can be very dangerous. A weak, thready pulse, sometimes a subnormal temp, but sometimes it's really hard to tell because older adults, I mean the normal can be 96.7, so it's hard to kind of tell. Flat neck veins, which again, they're not going to sink any lower than they are, so, you know, it might be a way to tell going from one to the other. So normal saline is isotonic. It expands volume. It is the preferred volume for immediate response. So generally when we had folks come in the emergency room, very first thing that you did, if they were in any kind of distress, is get at least a normal saline line running. If we needed to change it later, that was great, but at least we could start getting their volume managed. An IV was already accessed, whether we were running it or not. However, they are at risk for fluid overload. Remember, it's not going to take fluid from any interest, it's not going to shrink or expand any cells, right? But it is going to be a fluid replacer, so we can get too much fluid. Also remember, sodium plays with chloride, so we can have a hyperchloremic acidosis as well. Now, normal saline does not offer any free water. So remember when I said that 5% dextrose in water? So when I say in water, that's a hypotonic solution, right? A little bit, right? So what happens is it gives it just this little bump, just a little tiny bump, okay? So this would be good for someone who had a little bit of dehydration and an elevated sodium, okay? It's still considered isotonic, but this would be the solution that we would use for those folks. No calories, no additional electrolytes, and that's the reason we would use it, is because we already had expanded. Always use that with blood products, and it is compatible with most medications. However, if you look for compatibility, I have found medications that are not compatible with normal saline. So don't just assume when you guys get to be juniors and you're doing medication compatibility and it doesn't say normal saline there, and you're like, yeah, it's compatible with most. Yeah, no. You go either talk to a pharmacist, call a pharmacist, or whatever. Don't ever assume anything. What happens is it will come out of solution and form particulates, and you'll actually be putting particulates in them. It can be extremely dangerous. Also, it takes the medication from an active form into an inactive form in that particulate. So the patient isn't getting any medication either, okay? LR is isotonic. It's similar in composition to plasma. It doesn't have any magnesium, but it has all the other kinds of things you'll find in normal blood. It really still is isotonic, so it's just used to expand. In other words, you're not going to replace glucose. You're not going to replace sodium, even though it contains a little bit, okay? They usually use it to treat burns and GI losses. However, I've seen them use it for other reasons. It's contraindicated with hyperkalemia because it does contain potassium. And for patients with lactic acidosis, and you guys will learn a little bit more about that next week. Again, no free water, so no little whoop, none of that. And it doesn't have any calories. So D5W, free water, whoop, moves into the intracellular fluid. That's what that little boop is. It just gives it just a little goose, okay? So it's really good for patients who don't have, who have dehydration and just a little bit of an elevated sodium, and you don't want to give them any more sodium. You're not going to hook them up to normal saline. You're not going to hook them up to LR because they both contain sodium, okay? It also does help increase renal solute excretion. So for folks who are trying to get their kidneys to work better, this is generally what you'll see them use. Used to treat hypernatremia, does not provide any electrolytes, there's nothing else in there. So again, look down, not over. Half normal saline, 0.45, is a hypotonic solution, and 0.225, which is quarter normal saline. Hypotonic solutions are used for more concentration loss than plasma. Remember what hypotonic solutions will do, right? Remember they put water back in, so it treats cellular dehydration. When those little cells are all created, this is a big boo, not like a little boo, this is big boo, okay? So it treats cellular dehydration, so it actually shifts the fluid from the blood vessels into the intracellular spaces, okay? Promotes elimination by the kidneys. You can't administer this to patients at risk for third spacing or fluid shift. And this will increase intracranial pressure. Remember, the cells are up in the brain too. So anybody who's had any kind of damage to their head or any other kinds of things that would cause intracranial pressure. Now, I will tell you, any of these kinds of questions would be available to have on the exam. It's just you won't be necessarily choosing your, what could I say? You should know what a hypotonic solution does, what a hypertonic solution does, okay? Isotonic, you should know how to use to treat somebody. What kind of patient do you use? Does that make sense? Okay. Hypertonic solutions, 5% dextrose in normal saline, okay, different than water, and obviously 5% in half normal sodium. So hypertonic just means so that's a lot. It's a concentration, all right? Higher concentration of solutes than plasma. Fluids will shift now from the intracellular space into the ECF. So if you're looking to shrink cells, this is what you would use, okay? Again, not to administer with patients with kidney or heart disease. D5 half normal is a hypertonic solution. It is a common maintenance fluid on the floor, particularly in intermediate care units and ICU units for sure. Replaces fluid loss. Potassium chloride is often added for maintenance or replacement. That's the kind of stuff maybe, you're going to know that hypertonic solutions actually can move ions from one place to another. And probably, I'm not going to ask this kind of stuff. Okay, real deep kind of stuff like that. So look at these columns going down. So intravenous solutions containing electrolytes, again, normal saline, lactated ringers, 5% dextrose. Electrolytes are used for saline or electrolyte restoration or vascular volume. LR is used to treat metabolic acidosis. I think Rainey will talk about that next week. You always, always, always want to monitor. That should be nursing implications under any of it. And really, I think this is the last slide. So evaluation. Basically, you're going to evaluate everything you should have assessed to begin with. So vital signs. So, you're really looking for what's your blood pressure? Is it better or worse than it was before? Physical assessments, like if they were dry before, are they, oral mucous membranes and things like that, and turgor, is that better? So when you discharge a patient, you really need to talk about nutrition, things like using potassium containing salt substitutes if they had a potassium problem, if they're on potassium sparing diuretics, again, foods or supplements, potassium. Now, if they just need a little boost and they maybe don't need to take another pill of some kind and they're good at changing their nutrition, maybe they just need some nutrition education. So patients with congestive heart failure who often have fluid overload should do daily weights because they can start to tell when they're getting into danger zone and need to come into the hospital and be diuresed, which means they just will use IV diuretics to get weight off and their lungs cleared up again, okay? Nausea and vomiting, so if you've had a lot of that, remember you can have some electrolyte changes. Specific signs and symptoms of electrolyte imbalances like dysrhythmias, muscle twitching, etc. This is a deep one. I think this will be available for you guys to watch, to study from. I'm going to hand out a case study, and you can work on it until the end of class. We probably won't get all the way done, but I do have a voice thread that has the entire answers and rationale. So it's basically me standing in front of you telling you everything. So I will post that. I definitely would finish this and watch that voice thread. It will be crucial, I think, to you doing well on your next exam. So Lily, honestly, if you guys don't have any more questions, we probably can sign off here. I would like for you to stay in class for at least the next 10 minutes while we get the key room ready, and then you can come out, look at the key room, and go. Any questions? All right. We'll see you in the funny papers. Bye, Rochester. Okay, here we go. You're putting it there, that's going to be hard right now. Like, who does he think he is? Over the yes. That's so bad.
This whole weekend is
But I say it out loud. I think people like that's not this will be your IC. So I will actually okay, but we're gonna yeah, and then watch. Okay, everybody. Yeah. I want you guys to enjoy this. And I had art before with a class that ran out. And then like you see the yeah, no. Put it in half. Yeah, you know, so when do people start triggers? It's not. What lecture? Oh, blood pressure. Oh my God. Let's see. All right. I feel like that's what I'm No, not next time. Oh.